Before cybersecurity was a household name, a hidden virus factory in the Eastern Bloc was churning out malicious code that infected systems worldwide, from military networks to hospitals. This is the Intrusions in Depth podcast, and I'm Josh Stepp. In the late 1980s, the life of someone living in Sofia, Bulgaria, the capital city of the Eastern Bloc nation, was shaped by a dramatic political and economic and social changes happening around them as the country transitioned from communism to democracy, a fledgling democracy at that. One big change was adoption of personal computing. The IBM personal computers and Microsoft MS-DOS operating system, which stands for Microsoft Disk Operating System, was the combination of choice in Western nations. Bulgaria specifically was home to an emerging community of computer enthusiasts, tinkering with their own private 16-bit machines and pirated operating systems. These were IBM clones made domestically in Bulgaria. One of these enthusiasts was Vesselin Bontchev, a 29-year-old junior researcher at the Institute of Industrial Cybernetics and Robotics in Sofia, Bulgaria, the capital city. Now, Bontchev had a keen interest in computer science and a passion for understanding the inner workings of these new machines. And in 1989, his curiosity led him to a book on computer viruses by Professor Klaus Bernstein. This book, titled Report on Computer Viruses, Dangers, Effects, Structures, Early Detection, and Prevention, intrigued Bontchev. Well, it would have intrigued him if he could have read German. That's the English translated title, at least, as the entire book was written in German with a few diagrams presented in English. And, well, that presented an issue for Bontchev as he couldn't read it. But Bontchev wasn't a quitter. Despite not being able to read German, he pored through the technical appendix and identified several errors in the English portions of the book. He notified Bernstein of this via a letter that detailed all of his findings. And this letter caught the attention of one of his students, Morten Swimmer. Now, Morten was impressed with Bontchev's depth of knowledge. The two soon made contact, and Morten Swimmer invited Bontchev to collaborate on virus research with him in Hamburg, Germany. However, news of Bontchev's expertise also reached the ears of Blagopes Sendov, and I'm sorry if I'm butchering that name, but that was the chairman of the Bulgarian Academy of Sciences. Now, Sendov initially joked that Bontchev must be writing viruses, as he quickly recognized the young researcher's potential and offered him an opportunity to establish a computer virology lab at the academy in his home country of Bulgaria. And before we go any further in this tale, it's important to note that Bontchev, as you have likely heard, is a man of principle. He maintained that he has never written a computer virus himself, and took slight offense to that accusation, even if it was in a joking manner. But nonetheless, he eagerly accepted the offer. He saw this as a chance to study the emerging threat of computer viruses and hopefully develop effective countermeasures. Bontchev even went on to publish his home address in a Bulgarian computer magazine, inviting people to send him disks for a growing collection of virus samples. This is a bold move. Now, as Bontchev's reputation grew, so did the impact of his work. His detailed articles in Computer for You, a popular tech magazine at the time, aimed to educate the public about the dangers of computer viruses. Ironically, though, these articles inadvertently inspired more people to experiment with virus creation, contributing to the country's reputation as the Bulgarian virus factory.
The information presented in this show is sourced from publicly available materials and does not contain any classified or proprietary content. The views and opinions expressed are those of the host and guests alone, and do not reflect the official policy or position of their employers or any affiliated organizations. Enjoy the show.
In March of 1989, a new handle appeared on the virus writing scene, claiming to be the first virus writer from Bulgaria. Now, who was making these claims, despite them obviously being false? Dark Avenger. Now, this statement was incorrect, as Theodore Prevalensky had been creating viruses since November of 1988. He even experimented with writing quote-unquote good viruses to kill the bad ones. But this isn't a segment on him. It's time for the Dark Avenger, after all. The Dark Avenger's first virus, the first one to be analyzed, was called Eddie, and most researchers believed it to be named after the skeleton mascot from the band Iron Maiden. This doesn't require a lot of detective work. You'll catch on to it. Now, the copyright string was meant to kind of remove all doubt where the virus originated from. It read, quote, "This program was written in the city of Sofia, copyright 1988-89 Dark Avenger," end quote. And unlike most viruses at the time, Eddie would randomly destroy a disk sector on execution. Thus, it was destructive in nature. Vastly different from the kind of meme viruses at the time. As Bontchev pointed out in a recent article at the time, most viruses were harmless. They were meant to be annoying, just not destructive. The Dark Avenger wasn't playing some random tunes or anything like that, though. The Dark Avenger was breaking stuff. And here's a quote from Bontchev's own paper describing the virus. Quote, "On each 16th run of an infected program, it overwrote a sector at a random place of the disk, thus possibly destroying the file or directory that contained this sector. The contents of this overwritten sector was the first 512 bytes of the virus body. So even after the system had been cleaned up, there were files containing a string, quote, Eddie lives somewhere in time. And this was causing much more damage than if the virus was just formatting the hard drive. Since the destruction was very unnoticeable, his/her backups probably already contained corrupted data," end quote. And that's a line from an Iron Maiden quote, if someone doesn't know what Eddie lives somewhere in time is. Now, Eddie's spread, though, was almost epidemic by virtue of the mechanism it used to spread, targeting the command and executable files when they were executed, which is normal, but also when they were read, perhaps by a different program. So let's just say you ran your early antivirus program to rid the system of viruses. Well, that program, simply reading another program file, could make things worse. And since it only did it every 16th run and corrupted a disk sector, it would take a long time for you to kind of figure out something was jacked up. It's a pretty dirtbag thing to do. But Eddie was easily detectable. Once a program was infected, it would increase the size of the program on disk. Or you would notice it when your computer crapped out due to too many disk faults. Now, the mechanisms behind these early viruses were crude, especially by today's standards of process injecting, process hollowing, and in-memory payloads. However, this was the late 1980s and early 1990s, and the Dark Avenger was just getting started. In fact, Dark Avenger attributed viruses that were highly quote-unquote contagious were showing up all over the place. Computers belonging to militaries, banks, insurance companies, even medical offices. Worse, the Dark Avenger was inspiring other virus writers, and those virus writers were copying his techniques, like those observed in a series of samples called Murphy 1 and Murphy 2. However, those virus authors weren't as clever as the Dark Avenger, but they were jealous of his fame, so they would disassemble his viruses, steal parts of it, most of the time without knowing what they even did, all in an attempt to kind of Frankenstein them into their own malicious creations. Now, Murphy 1 and 2, these are viruses, were prime examples of this. And just as the Dark Avenger did with his copyright strings, Lubo and Ian removed all doubts of their origins in the copyright of the Murphy variants that they released. Their string was simply, quote, Lubo and Ian, USM Laboratory, Sofia, end quote. Oh, and in true OPSEC genius, these individuals used their real names and appeared in the local newspapers explaining why they felt the need to write these viruses. Now, according to them, it was for vengeance because they were not getting paid by their boss after doing some important work. Now, critical thinkers of this podcast, which you undoubtedly are because you're listening to it, you may be saying, but Josh, why would you need to write 2 variants for that? Well, my astute listener, they were probably lying. And even in the newspaper articles, the thought that maybe, just maybe, that these viruses would escape the laboratory or the intended victims, it didn't even cross their mind. Fast forward today, and you would assume that we have learned that in some ways by now. But if you go back and listen to my Not Pet Yet episode, you see that we haven't really got that far yet. Now, malwareans, virus authors, whatever we want to call them, but the individuals that write this alternative software don't use their real names, but code reuse is still common these days, especially if the exploit gets popular, a la Eternal Blue, or if the source code is dumped online, like Mirai botnets. While the Dark Avenger was just getting started, Bontchev's reputation grew, and so did the scope of his work. He became a founding member of the Computer Antivirus Research Organization, or CARO, which advocated for a strict prohibition against virus writing. And he continued to publish articles and give interviews, using his platform to educate the public about the dangers of computer viruses. Because you see, at the time, computer viruses were thought of to be kind of academic and something only in universities. It's not something that was kind of seen in the wild until this point. But even as Bontchev worked to combat the spread of the viruses, the Dark Avenger had begun releasing increasingly sophisticated and more destructive malicious ones. A rivalry was starting to form. You see, around this time, an online exchange popped up, simply named Virus Exchange, or VX. The admission to this virus exchange was one virus that had never been seen by the community. The Virus Exchange, or VX, kind of became a hub for virus writers to share their creations and gain notoriety, fame. In November of 1990, Dark Avenger joined the VX, and this is where his reputation as a brilliant virus writer exploded. His viruses, with their sophisticated code and malicious intent, quickly made him a star in the shadowy world. But Dark Avenger's influence wasn't confined to Bulgaria. His viruses began to spread beyond the country's borders, infecting computers in militaries, banks, insurance, and medical sectors worldwide. According to John McAfee, the head of the Computer Virus Industry Association, and yes, McAfee Antivirus Company would later come, as well as like alleged tax evasion and murder and the dying in a Spanish prison. But that John McAfee is quoted at the time as saying, quote, "I would say that 10% of the 60 calls we receive each week are for Bulgarian viruses, and 99% of those are for Dark Avenger," end quote. Bontchev didn't back down, though, in the face of all this. He continued to write articles for the Computer for You publication, in which he would dissect the code and expose the weaknesses of these viruses. Now, this public criticism didn't sit well with Dark Avenger. The rivalry between him and Bontchev grew, along with the occasional name-calling, a favorite of which being the Weasel. Dark Avenger even went as far as framing him by adding a false copyright to a later version of the Eddy virus. There were also lines of logic in Dark Avenger's viruses that would search out files with the name Vesselin Bontchev in them and then hang up the computer when it was found. Dark Avenger would also target John McAfee's products, particularly VirusScan, by uploading Trojan versions of it and various bulletin boards. But perhaps the nastiest, or at least one of the nastiest viruses Dark Avenger wrote appeared in the House of Commons Library in Westminster in October of 1990. And that's in England if you happen to not be staring at a globe right now. It's pretty far from Bulgaria. Now, the confused staff couldn't figure out why some of the files were missing and others were present, but they were heavily corrupted. The problem kept getting worse, prompting them to call in outside help. The outside virus specialists knew that there was an infection in the system as file sizes grew on disk. But every virus scan failed to detect the virus. Early scanners relied on signature matching after all. So this had to be something novel. As he started to look through the files, one pattern emerged. A jumble of characters. Nomen Lakonchura. And I'm sure I'm butchering that because I'm not Russian. But Nomen Lakonchura is a Russian term that literally translates to list of names, referring to the elite Soviet society comprising of bureaucrats and party leaders. who were granted special privileges in exchange for their service to the party and the state. Bulgaria also kind of adopted this system. However, the term carried like a pejorative connotation, particularly among those who were not included on the list. British researcher Alan Solomon got involved with this intrusion. He observed that this was the most destructive virus that he had ever seen. Unlike other viruses that targeted individual files, this virus aimed to corrupt the entire file system. Its primary target was the file allocation table, the FAT, which serves as a map on the disk. It indicates the locations of files. Now, when the FAT is compromised, the computer's operating system loses the ability to locate and execute said files. Solomon also observed some Cyrillic characters and suspected the origin was Bulgaria. Now, leveraging FidoNet, he reached out to a Bulgarian engineer for assistance. The engineer responded with the translation of the Cyrillic characters, quote, "This fat idiot, instead of kissing the girl's lips, kisses quite some other thing," end quote. And I'm not really 100% sure on where that comes from, but it's obviously something mildly offensive. And FidoNet, for clarity, was like an early version of the internet before it became the internet. It was like a bulletin board system in which users could exchange files, messages, emails, all of this over phone line. And it kind of fell out of favor when the internet took off. However, because of viruses like No Man La Conjura, Dark Avenger quickly gained notoriety across the Atlantic Ocean. Hey everyone. If you're enjoying this episode, I'd love for you to join the conversation over at IntrusionsInDepth.com. Sign up for my mailing list, and there you'll get exclusive updates and insights straight into your inbox. And while you're there, I could use your help to grow. Tell a friend, a coworker, anyone who would vibe with this podcast. Word of mouth is how we thrive, so let's make it happen. In the United States, Sarah Gordon stared at a small ping-pong type ball moving across her secondhand IBM PC XT computer. This was her first personal computer. Now, digging deeper, she noticed that whenever she accessed files on her disk, at the half-hour mark, a small ball type icon would bounce around on the screen. Now, the ball was actually the bulletin key. It was a small dot used in a list, like an unnumbered list. And her files appeared to be fine, but the ball was irritating. Sarah had no idea what was happening, so she asked around. However, in 1990, few Americans had encountered a computer virus in the wild. So Sarah took her research to FidoNet. And this is where she discovered the Bulgarian virus factory. As she searched the bulletin boards, she discovered a name which was treated with like an almost religious reverence. Dark Avenger. Despite her best efforts to communicate with this enigma, Dark Avenger wasn't interested and constantly ignored her request on FidoNet. The other virus writers and members of the boards would entertain her request, though. She quickly observed that these bulletin boards were full of people who traded viruses and cursed like sailors, which is like the virus exchanges or darknet forums of today. Except now they try to sell them. They're way more enterprising these days. This environment was something foreign to her, though. You see, Sarah wasn't a virus researcher or even in tech at the time. Growing up in extreme poverty in St. Louis, Sarah worked since she was 9, having held many jobs including juvenile crisis counselor, foster parent, songwriter, and apartment swimming pool custodian. Additionally, she grew her own food, and she liked to play with computers, as personal computing was just starting to be like a real thing. And when it came to schooling, Sarah had dropped out of school when she was 14 and ran away from home. By age 17, she received her high school diploma by passing every exam the school had offered, despite not taking any of the classes. And in the 1970s, she attended university for 2 years, studying theater and dance before dropping out. Now, one would call this like an atypical approach to an introduction in tech. And speaking of introductions to tech, you should all head over to my friends at the Stats on Stats podcast. It's on YouTube. And listen to other people's experiences getting into tech and how they overcome the challenges that they have in their different roles within tech. After this episode, though, because we're just getting started here. But head on over there and check it out. Stats on Stats podcast on YouTube. Now, Dark Avenger felt familiar to her, though. Given her experience as a juvenile counselor, she noticed the rebellious relationship that young men, well, the troubled ones, often have with authority figures. This made her feel comfortable on the boards. She understood these people. Where in hindsight, she made a rather irresponsible request, Sarah asked for a virus to be named after her after some time on these boards. And a few weeks later, like a malicious Bulgarian genie, Dark Avenger made her wish come true. A new piece of malware was uploaded to the virus bulletin board. In the source code of the virus, he commented, quote, "We dedicate this little virus to Sarah Gordon, who wanted to have a virus named after her," end quote. Now, the virus would be known as dedicated going forward. The virus itself isn't novel, especially compared to like the previous viruses written by Dark Avenger. But instead, it was only a piece of a much larger malware sample apparatus dubbed MTE. And this was big brain virus writing at the time. Dark Avenger had created a groundbreaking piece of malware, a polymorphic virus engine. And let's go down this rabbit hole a little bit. So first, what does MTE stand for? Well, it stands for Mutation Engine. And in simple terms, the Mutation Engine, MTE, is not a virus itself, but a tool that gives viruses polymorphic capabilities, the ability to change their code and shapeshift each time they infect a new file. Now, polymorphic means many forms, from the Greek word poly, meaning many, and morphic, which means form. A polymorphic virus alters its code without changing its functionality, making it harder to detect. This changes its encryption hash and other features, making the virus scanning software at the time pretty useless. Now, if you've ever done like any type of like primitive malware analysis, you can quickly kind of tell this is a behavior of a sample by executing it in a sandbox. Or I guess you could do it in production too if you hate your network. But sandbox is typically the way you want to do this. And execute it again and again and see if the hash changes when you do execute it. But let's discuss how the mutation engine works. On disk, a virus provides the mutation engine with details like its location, length, and size. The engine then rewrites the virus's code in a new mutated form each time it spreads to a new file. Now, the mutated code still performs the same malicious task, but its altered appearance makes it unrecognizable to the antivirus software, which relies on specific hard-coded values. Now, you see, like the downfall here is that the antivirus software from that time relies on having seen the infection prior. Someone had seen it before. Nowadays, we have machine learning-based detections and tools like Yara and ways to detect behaviors, which are kind of downstream of the infection. And there's also ways to determine if like a program's using too much CPU or power than it expects. But these were the early days. This stuff had not been thought of yet. And this made the MTE revolutionary and dangerous at the same time. Before the MTE, no one had seen a polymorphic virus engine. It was a game changer in virus writing. Worst of all, this program was accessible to anyone. The MTE was a compact, user-friendly program. It was just over 2,000 bytes, named mte.obj. Even beginners with little technical knowledge could use it to create undetected, self-replicating viruses. Now, good thing we learn from our mistakes and we don't open source malware these days, though. I'm kidding. We still open source malware. Like the open source malware of today, it allowed anyone with the virus to plug it into the MTE and produce countless mutated versions, democratizing the creation of sophisticated viruses, and being highly disruptive to any traditional antivirus efforts. Sarah Gordon, the curious individual, asked for something simple, but received a tool with catastrophic potential. As Scott Shapiro put it in Fancy Bear Goes Fishing, she asked for a BB gun, but got a nuclear weapon instead. Now, pivoting back to Bulgaria, Bontchev still spent a majority of his time fighting viruses. Despite this being a frustrating task, he didn't dislike the virus writers. After all, some of them he considered friends and even sympathized with why they wrote viruses. As we'll talk about a little bit later, he knew most of these young men had great skills and no outlet to use them, which in some ways feels like a problem in today's society as well. I think this is a rather common trend, though. I'm blown away by the creativity of these game hackers and the skills of some of these YouTubers when they fire up Ghidra and go to town on the latest Steam offering. I mean, I'm stoked that they went this route and not something more harmful. I'm sure the game companies hate this, but I'd rather them hack games than not be some ransomware operators. However, Bontchev never really understood Dark Avenger. Most virus writers were immature and had a goal of just being funny. They were seen as tricksters, and these viruses were seen as tricks. Dark Avenger chose destruction, though, often to break stuff, be malicious. And this was foreign to the model that Bontchev had built in his head about those involved in the virus factory known as Bulgaria. Vesselin did have an understanding of the vitriol that Dark Avenger felt for him, though. It was part of the motivation for writing the Computer for You articles, in which he highlighted errors in his code and often called it sloppy. Think of this like a relationship between an artist and a critic. It's way harder to write something new and novel, be creative, and put it out in the world, only for someone else who spent a fraction of the time and effort to tear it apart. I think anyone could kind of sympathize with that. I could sympathize with it. Adding to this was that online in these virus boards, Dark Avenger was seen as a hero, while Bontchev brought him back down to earth. This codependency between the two appears to have been needed, though. Oftentimes, competition brings out the best in both parties, a drive to execute at a higher level. It even got to the point where gossip started trickling out that Dark Avenger was merely a sock puppet for Bontchev, so he could gain fame and notoriety himself. Coupled with all of that, even the people who didn't believe the rumors still thought that Bontchev was being too abrasive and too harsh towards the Dark Avenger in these publications. On the other hand, Dark Avenger was probably motivated to push harder and develop the NTE. According to Scott Shapiro in Fancy Bear Goes Fishing, quote, in 1991, Dark Avenger sent the following announcement to FidoNet. Hello all antivirus researchers who are reading this message. I am glad to inform you, my friends, that and I are developing a new virus that will mutate in one of 4 billion different ways. It will not contain any consistent information. No virus scanner can detect it. The virus will have many other new features that will make it completely undetectable and very destructive. The responses, however, were uniformly negative, some abusively so. The idea of creating a mutation engine to defeat all forms of antivirus software was deemed too dangerous. Virus writers have upcode too, and Dark Avenger even violated their lax rules. He didn't take it too well. I've received no friendly replies to my messages. That's why I will not reply to all of these messages saying, you. That's why I will not say anything more about my plans. End quote. But there was one person who was nice to Dark Avenger, Sarah Gordon. And this is where Sarah Gordon's curiosity made an impact to the field of cybersecurity. And there's many, but I'm going to focus on the sort of psychological aspect of profiling these virus writers, getting to know the people who write viruses. Now, in an effort not to spoil the book, but this section is fascinating. Sarah conducted surveys where she asked hundreds of virus writers questions to determine their maturity levels, views on society, and so on. Throughout this work, she was able to build a model for these virus writers and notice that, like other crimes, the men, or young men in this case, writing these viruses kind of aged out of it. Now, research from the 1940s suggests this trend that over time, the amount of crime an individual does usually plummets around age 30. Sarah Gordon observed similar trends with her virus authors that she researched. I'm not a social scientist or anything else, but there's probably a ton of contributing factors that lead to this. Not everyone matures at the same time, either due to nature or nurture, but by 30, it's probably most people. In the case of men, testosterone starts to level off in their 30s, which probably has some sort of calming effect. If they have started a family, the desire to protect and provide is there, and it's hard to do that if you're in jail or dead or even injured. Now, personally speaking, as a man, or at least as I tell myself I am every morning in the mirror, as part of my billion dollar morning routine, I know this from also being around men too. But when I was in my 20s and even early 30s, I didn't think anything could hurt me. But now that I'm brushing up on 40, I have little desire to compete in jiu-jitsu tournaments or hold out on tapping to submissions out of ego. Even as like a longtime brown belt, I don't feel like being banged up any more than I already am. And you realize that eventually, no one really cares about these results but me. I know getting hurt only makes the things I like to do, training more, doing stuff with my family, much more difficult. It kind of sucks to wake up hurting all the time. I think this is common. Well, wisdom comes from maturity. But there's an outlier component too. There's outliers in almost every data set. And Dark Avenger was Sarah Gordon's outlier. I've recently been contributing to an upcoming book on fictional state-sponsored threats, and it's been a lot of fun making the story more realistic. I've really enjoyed the experience and open to collaborating more. Like that project, I was discovered via this podcast. So if you're looking for contributors for a project you're working on, feel free to reach out to me. I have a forum on my webpage at IntrusionsInDepth.com to sync up and collaborate. I'd love to hear from you. When Dark Avenger dedicated a virus that he made with the MTE to Sarah Gordon, it was alarming. Her naive request was responded to with a giant leap forward in capabilities for virus writers. When Sarah Gordon reached out to Dark Avenger with her survey, he was shocked as well, and dismissive, replying with, quote, "You should see a doctor. Normal women don't spend their time talking about computer viruses," end quote. Sarah Gordon and Dark Avenger communicated for 5 months, and to this day, Sarah has never released any of those messages. Only excerpts she's published with Dark Avenger's permission. I personally have a lot of respect for that. It would have been way more profitable to Sarah if she would have just exposed all. But she has morals after all, and respects Dark Avenger's wishes. I like honesty and integrity. It's really hit home for me. Now, the snippet she did publish revealed that Dark Avenger was complex, morally confused, and just a all-around kind of troubled individual. On one hand, he would show remorse for his behaviors and consider the moral consequences for his action. On the other hand, though, he would blame the victims and be belligerent or even resentful. Dark Avenger was unique compared to the other virus writers interviewed by Sarah Gordon. She even pushed him to understand his hatred for Bontchev, as Sarah was one of those individuals who originally believed that Bontchev and the Dark Avenger were one and the same. Until she talked to both of them, and that theory quickly dissipated. Both men were on completely different sides of the spectrum. Dark Avenger even mailed her the source code to a virus and a floppy disk with the new virus on it and a photograph, which wasn't of Bontchev. Dark Avenger, despite his acknowledgement of knowing what he was doing was morally wrong, he was driven by a hatred of Bontchev, specifically the checking of his ego, and by feeling wrong from the class structure of communism. Essentially, it boiled down to only rich people had computers, and computers are toys, and people infect computers when they pirate software, so they kind of deserve it. He admitted to Sarah that he enjoyed the fame from writing the viruses and had a deep vitriol for Bontchev, to the point where he urged her not to talk to him anymore and calling him a weasel any chance he could. Dark Avenger believed that Bontchev only made the problem worse by publishing his articles to become a leading expert. He believed that his work was being used to help further validate Bontchev as well. Having more viruses only propelled him to write more articles and advanced his career. And he knew that the socio-economic dynamics at the time would only push new virus writers to want the fame and notoriety as well. It was kind of one of their only outlets, as that's like another gem of communist class structure. Ultimately, her communication with Dark Avenger stopped when he learned that she was getting married. So this leads us to the point where we ask, who was Dark Avenger? Let's discuss that now. To this day, there are two theories of who Dark Avenger is or was, and I don't really know what the correct tense is to use there, so let's just skip past that part. Now, Dark Avenger is either a he or they. It's one individual or a group of individuals. If you listen to my Phineas Fisher series, you'll likely know that this is a common theory behind Phineas Fisher's identity as well. When pressed, neither Bontchev or Gordon would reveal the true identity of Dark Avenger, despite both claiming to know who the true identity of Dark Avenger is. In much earlier interviews, however, Bontchev had named someone in a German television show. Todor Todorov. Now, Todorov is known as Commander Tosh, and Todor is the Bulgarian who started Virus Exchange, the VX bulletin board, in 1990. Here's another excerpt from the book Fancy Bear Goes Fishing, which outlines this evidence. Quote, circumstantial evidence links Todorov to Dark Avenger. Dark Avenger stopped releasing viruses in 1993, a few weeks before Todorov left Bulgaria for 3 years. Then, in January 1997, a hacker calling himself Dark Avenger gained root access to the University of Sofia network. For 2 days, he controlled the largest university system in the country. Todorov had returned to Sofia a month earlier, in December 1996. When David Benham, a writer for Wired, contacted Todorov in 1998, he got a hostile response. What do you think of Vesselin Bontchev? Benham asked. He's an idiot. And Sarah Gordon? She's a nice lady. End quote. Sarah Gordon, on the other hand, doesn't believe this to be true, and neither does Bontchev these days. The modern theory of Dark Avenger's identity is something like, as fame grew, multiple people took over the persona as Dark Avenger. Todor could have possibly be one of them, but there were also allegations that it was disgruntled students from the University of Sofia. But this theory does hold water, as the viruses released by the Dark Avenger kind of grew exponentially in complexity and code quality, suggesting kind of a group effort. Even though the Dark Avenger's true identity isn't known, almost 3 decades later by the general public and podcasters, the impact that a small Eastern Bloc country had on the global scale and the role that Dark Avenger had in that is impressive, even as the golden age of the Bulgarian virus factory came to an end in the 1990s. And with that, I think this is a good time to pivot into some of the broader aspects of this tale and what were some of the contributing factors for this phenomenon in Bulgaria. While reading Scott Shapiro's book, Fancy Bear Goes Fishing, The Dark History of the Information Age and in 5 Extraordinary Hacks, and this story in particular, I couldn't help but think about how did an Eastern Bloc country like Bulgaria get this reputation for being such a hotbed of computer viruses? Kind of like a Silicon Valley at the time. What was so unique about this country for this hobby to foster? What parallels could one observe in today's global environment? Luckily, Bontchev had written about this topic on his personal website too. This must be how historians and archaeologists feel when they find diaries and journals of people. So with that being said, most of this is derived from those sources, with my own thoughts sprinkled in. And as always, I've linked through to these papers and the Scott Shapiro book, and there's a ton more in both of them. I mean, these kind of should be required reading for anyone in this field. That's just my own personal opinion, though. I'm going to touch on this in a moment, but it helps to understand the problems faced by others before you understand the trends and issues they faced and how they solved them. Much like when you're a new developer, or I guess maybe people never look at code. I keep forgetting that there's 500 people that listen to these episodes and not the 4 people I pay to write nice things about me online. But let's just theoretically speak here. But when you encounter a new code base, or let's put it this way. Generally speaking, when a project is sufficiently large, there's a temptation to start fresh. This comes from not knowing the code base and believing that you know the best way to solve all these issues, and that all the other people in front of you were just idiots. However, once you take on this endeavor, the code base issues you discover make sense when you account for the problems that they faced. It's likely there's a few semantic changes in your new version. Maybe use a different type of loop or something, or maybe your variables are different. But most of the functions and methods and data processing methods, they end up kind of looking the same. Turns out you solve problems in a similar way. And starting new isn't always an option. It's usually worth your time to understand the code base in most instances. That's where the real talent is, especially in my opinion. Also, can we get back to writing documentation and write-ups in the old school way? When old school exploit or vulnerability research took place, or even coding projects, the developer would outline their thought processes for solving set issues and why certain things are the way they are. I miss that as both a learning tool and how people think, and it explains design processes. Anyway, I'm getting way away from myself. But back to the conditions on the ground that made Bulgaria a hotbed for virus writers at the time. As Bontchev points out, quote, The existence of a huge army of young and extremely qualified people, computer wizards, who are not actively involved in the economic life. End quote. This is what terrifies me as a blue teamer, defender, security thought leader, or whatever else buzzwords I put in my LinkedIn profile these days. That reminds me, I need to put like the word AI agent in there some way. But in all seriousness, this is one of the biggest problems of today's environments, especially in Russia and other Eastern European countries. There's huge incentives to be criminals or part of a criminal gang online exploiting individuals in the West, scamming people. Sure, there's the off chance that you get caught or you didn't bribe the right Kremlin official and you get arrested as part of some Russian PR stunt. But it's better than the alternative of working some low-wage job or invading another country on the front lines in the battle of attrition. Now, this happens outside of Russia too. There's allegations of moonlighting among Iranian and Chinese APT groups, and even lone wolf types like Phineas Fisher have talked about their day job being a cyber criminal. But having a highly skilled populace without an outlet to succeed legally fosters an environment for them to succeed illegally. It's an incentives game, behavioral economics 101. And speaking of economics, Bulgaria was a communist, socialist utopia, while all of this was gaining traction. So innovation and efficiency wasn't something you need. You actually want less efficiency, as the only way you can move up in the system is typically hiring more people to work under you. And you need to manage more people and more money. Well, using computers to be efficient does quite the opposite. Bulgaria's use of computers and the manufacturing of computers, especially hardware, was to supply the motherland, the Soviet Union at the time. And you see, that's because they had this sweet embargo on them from the West, so software and hardware wasn't allowed to be shipped to them, much like the AI chips export restrictions against China today. The West didn't want to empower their enemies. So Bulgaria adopted the practice of cloning IBM and Apple PCs for use in the Soviet Union. Then, instead of writing new software, they would spend their time pirating Western software and adding their own copyright notices to them. So instead of Microsoft Word being made in like Redmond, Washington, it would say Soviet Word, Sofia, Bulgaria, but underneath it be the same thing, the same code. And this is just an example. Word wasn't around then. Now, Bontchev argues it would have made more sense to channel those young people into writing software instead of the mundane task of building hardware. Quote, at the time, most Western software was copy protected. Instead of training our skilled people in writing their own programs, we began training them in breaking copy protection schemes. And they achieved great success in this field. The Bulgarian hackers are the best in cracking copy-protected programs. Besides, they had no real hope in making and selling their own programs, since due to a total lack of copyright law on computer software, it was impossible to sell more than 1 or 2 copies of a computer program in Bulgaria. The rest was all pirated. End quote. You see, Bulgaria had a ton of young, smart people who learned Russian math, as my friend would often say. And the point of that joke is that he would say Russian math is way better than American math. And this is kind of the reasoning behind thinking of Bulgaria as kind of like a Russian Soviet Union Silicon Valley at the time. There was a lot of potential there. And there's a reason young people start software companies today. The investment is small in capital, but high in time and creativity, something they have. Plus, there's no cost to scale code and media. There's been numerous companies started by just throwing something useful in GitHub. And this brings us to the next reason Bulgaria became a hotbed for viruses: software piracy. And once again, I want to quote Bontchev as he explains this issue concisely and was on the ground when all of it was happening. Quote, the second main reason is the widespread practice of software piracy, which was in fact a kind of state policy, and the very low payment of these average programmers. As was mentioned above, Bulgaria took the wrong direction in producing computers and stealing programs. There's still no copyright law concerning computer software there. Because of this, software piracy was an extremely widespread practice. In fact, almost all software products used were illegal copies. Most people using them had never seen the original diskettes or original documentation. Very often, there was no documentation at all. Since all kinds of programs, from games to desktop publishing systems, were copied very often, this greatly helped the spreading of computer viruses. At the same time, the work of the average programmer was valued very low. There were almost no chances to sell his or her software products. Even now, a programmer in Bulgaria is paid to 100 to 120 times less than a programmer with the same qualifications in the USA. This causes several young people to become embittered against the society that was unable to evaluate them as it should. End quote. And this leads to another societal issue around governance of this behavior. There's no copyright or IP laws for software, and no laws prohibiting malicious uses of software. As I've stated, in the West, we have copyright laws, which can get too restrictive in some cases and kind of turns into a pay-to-play game in some cases. But nonetheless, they exist to curb this type of behavior, in theory. And then there's Computer Fraud and Abuse Act stuff, the CFAA. And other countries have similar laws, which sometimes put people in prison longer than violent criminals. But these are meant to deter malicious uses. Like I've hinted at before, I believe both of these get abused and have swayed from the intent of the laws, especially the CFAA. But they exist. Someone or society has determined that this is behavior that we want to curb. I'm not going to harp on this, but look into Weave and AT&T. 41 months for sending GET requests to a piece of crap system made by a multi-million-dollar telecommunications provider is stretching the term malicious, in my opinion. But as we can see, there's consequences, and that's the point I'm trying to make here. Those consequences didn't exist in Bulgaria. The other kind of societal issues at hand revolve around the perceptions of these being a joke rather than something serious, which is still an issue today, especially among the younger groups of teenage attackers that are active online. For example, the 4chan flame wars that are happening currently, I'm a big fan of. It's kind of funny, and admittedly, I probably fall into this boat as well. I'm not saying that I get joy out of attacking people or that I'm some type of black hat hacker admitting to pwning people at night or anything like that. There's certainly attacks or details from attacks that I find funny, though. Phineas Fisher's manifestos were funny. LulzSec was funny. Looting Minecraft servers to kill an Ender Dragon a la Exentra's course is funny. And that's part of the quote-unquote hacker culture that exists to do things for the lulz, the IRC wars, website defacements, etc., etc. I think we all get where I'm going here. But I also believe that most people are able to distinguish between curiosity or playfulness or activism and malicious actions like taking down a hospital or power company. Just for the record, that's not cool. Or scamming people, not cool either. But then again, read Weave's story and you can see that the ones crafting, prosecuting, and judging these cases have no idea how the internet works, how networks and computers work, or why AT&T should have carried some of the fault in that. But along those same lines, and something we still see today, is the status game of being a virus writer or being an attacker, doing it for the glory. I don't think this will ever change though, but it was still a contributing factor. Now, expanding the aperture a bit more, there's also factors around the information just being publicly available on how to do this. Once again, something else that's still present today. Myself and John Pareto discussed this on my Lapses Part 2 episode. It's a shameless plug. You should listen to it. And finally, there's also a corporate and military purpose for writing viruses or malicious research or piracy. We tried to curb some of this through the use of licensings and terms and agreements. But as the old saying goes, anything is open source if you know how to reverse engineer. On the military side, in Bulgaria, this was nearing the end of the Cold War. But Russia and the United States, and other countries for that matter, were still exploring malicious ways to knock the adversaries' networks out, or get into those networks to steal information. Spoiler alert, it still happens today. Perhaps it's some type of epigenetic reaction that's like baked into our DNA because all of our ancestors at one point probably encountered a plague or survived a plague to some degree, or at least they were able to reproduce prior to it taking them out. But because of all of that, the word virus has an almost disgusting, traumatic reaction of avoidance. So when the cybersecurity and computer experts at the time start adopting this lexicon, it invoked the same reaction from the general public around computer viruses. Even some of the remediation or cures utilize techniques we use in meat space to cure viruses, i.e. quarantining a computer so it can't spread. Spoiler alert though, quarantining saves the network, but unlike a real person, eventually you have to get in there and deal with the virus. Nowadays, we have collectively moved away from the term virus in favor of malware and types of malware, worms, trojans, etc., etc. But I'm not trying to start a fight here by trying to define all of that and getting people all in a tizzy. But I think it's important to understand where that was coming from. Other places were writing viruses at the time, but it was a mixture of publicity, notoriety, and fear that elevated Bulgaria to kind of the top of it. And this was the start of a number of people's careers, or at least played a role in getting their careers off the ground. People that had influence in shaping where cybersecurity is today. Vesselin Bontchev has been a researcher for well over 30 years at this point, and still pumps out all these honeypots for various platforms and useful tools. I personally have utilized P-code dump, both on engagements and in training others. It's a valuable tool when dealing with macros, especially if they are messing with the P-code behind the scenes. Now, Sarah Gordon went on to produce groundbreaking research on the psychology of virus writers, hackers, and social issues in computing. I've included quite a few of her DEF CON talks in the show notes of this episode. But what's interesting, at least to myself, is that most of these issues are still present today. It's mostly young men looking for some type of status, mainly among themselves, and sometimes it's financially motivated as well, but usually it's out of resentment or humor. But I've covered most of this in my 2 Lapses episodes as well, so that's probably a more modern day example of all of this. And speaking of careers, John McAfee also went on to start McAfee antivirus software, as well as live an interesting life of drugs and pump and dump crypto scams, and probably a bunch of other illegal stuff before turning up dead in a Spanish prison. And just before someone asks, there's plenty of videos and documentaries about his life and everything like that. I'll link through to some of those, but personally speaking, I have no desire to touch any of that. It's been beaten to death at this point. And with that, I think this is a good place to wrap up. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please do me a solid and like and share and subscribe to it on your favorite podcast player, YouTube, or wherever you're listening to it. Or you could just do all 3 of them if you wanted to. That'd be cool too. Also, while you're at it, please share it with your network as well. This podcast's growth is entirely driven by listeners like you. And I also have a mailing list at IntrusionsInDepth.com where you can follow the show. You can get alerts, new episode drops, and even participate in AMAs and episode discussions. And with that, I'm Josh Depp. Thanks for listening.